The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon completed the first volume of his book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. This book is still considered a prominent historical work, both paradoxically in the field of historical scholarship and because of Gibbon's charismatic and intelligent style. The work shows Gibbon's prejudices as an upper-class British man, such as his anti-Catholicism and his negative view of the powerful women in history and its repetition. In addition, his stereotypes about Eastern cultures, Gibbon sparked a debate among his contemporaries and subsequent generations with references that Christianity played a role in the fall of the Roman Empire. However, the book contributed to the establishment of standards for historical research that are still applied today. These criteria include a critical consideration of primary sources and an attempt to explain historical trends rather than simply attributing historical change to the actions of great individuals. Before he begins to argue about the fall of Rome, Gibbon started by describing the greatness of Rome, where he says that in the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Roman Empire included the most beautiful and civilized parts of the earth. The success of the Roman Empire was based on the strength and discipline of its army, a rich urban society, and a religiously tolerant and intellectually open culture. However, Gibbon also argues that Rome began to become corrupt from within because of its richness. In Gibbon's opinion, the Roman Empire was at its peak in the 2nd century AD under the rule of emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The decline began when Marcus Aurelius was succeeded by his son Commodus, who became a corrupt tyrant who cared more about combat games in the arenas instead of ruling. After the assassination of Commodus, the Praetorian Guards, a special unit of soldiers dedicated to protecting the emperor and Rome, began to install and depose the emperors as they pleased. At the same time, there was a series of civil wars after which General Severus became emperor. While the former emperors ruled as if they were the chief judges of the Republic, Septimius Severus ran the empire as a military dictator. He increased the size of the army and gave them more money, and with this power the whole army started to appoint its officers as emperors. With the dawn of the 3rd century, there were quick successions of emperors who were killed in battles or assassinated or forced to die by suicide. At the same time, the Germanic groups, especially the tribes known as Goths, became more organized and dangerous to the empire. Gibbon says no emperor felt safe on the throne. The series of assassinated emperors and long barbarian invasions ended towards the end of the 3rd century with the rule of Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian defeated the threats the empire faced at the borders and reformed the government to give it much-needed stability while imposing harsher taxes. Among the emperor's changes was the establishment of a system consisting of 4 emperors, the great emperors like Augusti and the small Caesars, who ruled different parts of the empire. However, once Diocletian abdicated, the regime collapsed and the Roman Empire returned to civil war. Gibbon's story ends in Volume 1 with the rise of Emperor Constantine to power and the unification of the empire again under the rule of one emperor. Edward Gibbon's book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was part of a major change in how history was thought and written in Western and Central Europe. History written before Gibbon in the Middle Ages were often written by clergy in the church, with some exceptions. Many of these works were records of cities and local areas intended to record facts or histories of the world, starting from the creation of humanity as described in the book of Genesis in the Bible until the time of the author. These histories tended to accept the full credibility of the Holy Book and ancient sources, and they were more concerned with conveying religious and moral truths to the reader rather than historical analysis as we understand it today. Even when these works were written by people outside the church, they often wrote with the idea that historical events were directed by God and that major events stemmed from achievements, virtues, crimes, and mistakes of great individuals. However, with the discovery and translation of the works of pre-Christian historians such as the Greek historian Thucydides and the Roman biographer Suetonius, this view of history began to change. The intellectual movement of the Renaissance inspired scholars to be more critical of historical and religious sources. Historians began to focus on human, cultural, and social power rather than merely recording events, and began to assert human control over events instead of seeing history as part of God's divine plan. By the 17th and 18th centuries during the Enlightenment, these shifts in historical thought had become more entrenched. In fact, works from the French Enlightenment, such as Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline by Montesquieu and The Age of Louis by Voltaire, reduced the importance of individual figures in history and instead focused on political, cultural, and social trends. While Gibbon also discussed broad trends in history, such as his contemporary French Enlightenment writers, but he still retained a focus on individual historical figures. For Gibbon, there is no problem in seeking to write history as a dramatic narrative and in a scientific and analytical way. Thank you for watching.